All right, here we go. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar where our presenters will discuss GASB 75 managing OPEB costs and other liabilities in paving budget. My name is James Collins. I am the Senior Director of Business Development here at CSBA, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. If at any time during our webinar you have a question for our panelists or you experience a technical issue, please use the questions tab of your Zoom dashboard. We have reserved time toward the end of today's presentation to address as many of your questions as time permits. However, if your question is not answered during the course of the webinar, please feel free to email csba@csba.org and our staff will be happy to assist. With that said, I'd like to introduce today's panelists, Dennis Myers, Assistant Executive Director of Governmental Relations here at CSBA, and Ryan Nicasio, Vice President of PARS. So at this time, I'll turn it over to you, Dennis.
Great. Thank you, James. And it's always great to walk through these important issues here along with PARS to talk about, kind of the importance of what's going on now in school finance and how it relates to OPEB Solutions Program. So let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do is really just talk about where the state budget looks like it's heading right now. This is just an incredible time kind of in our history because there is an investment opportunity here that is being made because of really large increase in the Prop 98 guarantee, which I think allows you some opportunities here to make some investments into your ongoing liabilities. So just starting here, this kind of shows what's going on right now with Proposition 98. Proposition 98 reflects what's going on with the state budget and the state general fund. So as we see here, just that top line is that, current year budget, the K-12 portion of that is about 83.4. And then looking at these other numbers, just the difference between the current budget and the January budget and then the current budget and the May revision, we're looking at $16 to $19 billion more that's available from year to year. And as I said, that is a once in a career, once in a lifetime increase that we've never seen before. And the expectation is that we're not going to see it again. Also, that last slide is that we are in test one. The reason why that's just important to note is because we are now guaranteed a specific share of the state general fund. When you've heard us for all these other years talking about test 2 or test 3, those are because we were in light inflation years, but our system was growing in enrollment. Since we now have good growth in the state general fund and our enrollment is actually declining, we're in these test 1 years. The reason why I say that is because we live and we die on the growth or decline in the state general fund. And it's estimated that we're going to continue to be in test 1 into the near future. Next slide, please. Let's dive in now to just kind of some of the things that are important for you to be thinking about as we go into the part that Ryan's going to be talking about. So obviously, in the current year, there was a cost of living increase. That was a 2-year cost of living increase for LCFF that actually included what I'm going to call a super COLA, but I hate using that term. Inflation over the 2 years was actually 4.05%, but we were able to get the legislature and the governor to agree to go beyond that and to invest more into base revenue. As you recall, we've been talking about increasing base funding for more than 2 years now. It's really hot and heavy right now, but we've been talking about this for a couple of years now. And in that current year budget, then there was the increase into LCFF. The issues that we're looking at also is special education and other categorical programs received other COLAs, but COLA, when we talk about COLA, it's always about statutory COLA and what's required by law. But when you go above COLA, that's when the legislature and the governor are actually making more in investments. And so that's obviously a good thing as well. One of the cautionary notes that I just put this bullet here is, the legislature, when they adopted the current year budget, put into place these weird independent study requirements that were, related to COVID. They really wanted schools to reopen. Most school districts in the state were open, They didn't understand that. They were looking at kind of some of the urban centers. And so they put these tight restrictions in place, passed the bill, school had already started. Then they started working on the audit guide. Audit guide got adopted. And now you're talking to your auditors and we're seeing a lot of exceptions coming out. So I just wanted to kind of put that out here as something to be cautious about, because as good as things are in the current year, there's also then these the kind of the frightening conversations that we know that you're starting to have with your audits. And when there's audit exceptions, that means some sort of reduction in funding. So that's on our radar, but that needs to be on your radar too as you're planning your budgets. Next slide, please. So now looking at the May revision, as you recall, the January budget, the governor called, included a statutory COLA of 5.33%. The May revision, the COLA at that point jumps now to 6.56%. And every time we present this fact, none of you out there are going, oh, hey, that's great, because that's what inflation is right now. We know inflation is about 8.5 or 8.3. The reason why the numbers are different is because the index used for COLA in statute is always a couple of quarters behind current. So that's why, yes, we got the jump from January to May, but that's still a couple months, in arrears. So nonetheless, the governor did recognize that, so that there is a proposal to increase LCFF. And then the COLA would then apply to other categorical programs that also have a statutory COLA. So we listed, I think, almost all those, or maybe a few smaller programs that the higher COLA applies to. The big ones, obviously, are special education, child nutrition, and the adult ed block grant. And so those are included in the May revision as well. Now we're going to start talking about the investment above COLA. The governor has proposed, and this is absolutely an incredible win for CSBA and for other advocates. As I said, CSBA, we've been talking about this for several years now, but the governor has recognized the importance to invest more in LCFF than just statutory COLA. So he's proposed another $2.1 billion in ongoing money. This would be for the next fiscal year. And we pencil that out at about 3.2%. So if you think about 6.56% cost of living increase, add to that the governor's 3.2%. Now we're talking about almost 10% increase in LCFF. And that's how I was kind of teeing it up at the beginning, where there is significant money now for you to maybe start thinking about some of these, set aside money for some of your future liabilities. There's also included in there money for county offices of education. Not all county offices would play in this, but the recognition is COLA is insufficient. Let's invest more into base funding. So many of you have been talking to legislators about that for a long time. The Senate and the Assembly have both bought into that. Their numbers are higher, but now the governor has. So we have the three major components of the state budget agreeing that more needs to be put into LCFF. And that absolutely is good news now. For planning purposes, what you may be going through right now, we're thinking it's not going to go less than where the governor is. And then the potential to go higher is still there, because the governor and the two legislative leaders on the Democratic side are talking about that. So it'll be somewhere between 10%-ish where the governor is and 15%-ish where the legislature has kind of staked its claim over the last couple of weeks. Next slide. Also in the May revision is, because you have been experiencing declining enrollment the last couple of years, and that declining enrollment protection ends on June 30. So you have this hold harmless that if you've been declining in enrollment, you've been protected. That protection ends on June 30. So now we've been talking about, hey, what about this cliff that that is approaching? So in January, the January budget included, and the governor was good in including this. The proposal was for those of you who are declining, to include like this 3-year averaging. So what that meant is you could take your current enrollment, or you can take your current enrollment or your prior year enrollment. That's how declining enrollment works now. Then the governor proposed this 3-year averaging to kind of soften that decline. But then the governor also in the May revision adopted something that CSBA had been lobbying for along with AXA for probably since late or about December-ish, when we saw the Delta variant hitting attendance. We knew the Omicron variant was coming. We started working on this, and sure enough, many of you over that 2 or 3 month period saw your attendance decline by, some of you were down by 20%. And so what we start thinking of is, wait a minute, if there's going to be this hit to attendance in the current year, that's going to, it's not going to necessarily hurt your current year ADA because we're living under the, the hold harmless, but that will hurt in the out years if we're talking about this 3-year averaging. The governor agreed. The governor put that in the May revision. We think that's obviously positive. So as you're thinking forward into your budgeting, you can then think about, okay, so here's how current year works. Here's this potential growth in the LCFF. It looks like these categoricals are getting funded. And then if you were worried about the potential of losing current year ADA in the future, as you're thinking about 3-year averaging, if you're declining, that looks to be something that has a good chance of happening. The reason why I'm not being 100% celebratory on that issue is because there are members of the legislature that are having flashbacks to 2020, when a few of them were saying, hey, you're not open, schools need to open, because they were living in some of the more urban areas. And they're having flashbacks saying, well, why do you want this current year ADA protection? Schools needed to be open, and we are just continuing to hammer away and say schools were open and we need protection because there was this 2 or 3 month period when kids were just getting sick, employees were getting sick, but schools were open. And so we have some convincing to do with a couple of key assembly members mainly, but the fact that it's in the May revision is good. So we have some protections there that build out in the next fiscal years, which we think also is a good development and helps you in your planning. Next slide, please. Good, thank you. Just on this page here is I'm not going to go through all of the different proposals. There are probably 10 or 15 programmatic changes that are suggested in the May revision. The reason why I pulled these out is because as you're planning into next year, but also as you might be thinking about, what we're going to be talking about here, with PARS, is that there is a proposal for one-time discretionary money. The governor's $8 billion proposal, it's one time, Prop 98, it's worth about $1,500 per ADA, substantial amount of money. You'll see language that says to attempt to guide you on where to put this, and the governor and the legislature feels necessary to do that, but this is discretionary. It's usable for any purpose, but they will say, and our intent is that you use it here, but it is discretionary. There's also $1.8 billion that's proposed for deferred maintenance. Now that's not going to go out per ADA, that'll go out per unduplicated pupil, but there is a minimum of $100,000. Again, it helps you to prepare and plan ahead for some potential investments. And so we wanted to call this out. The rest of these here are other pieces of the budget that are obviously potentially helpful, let's say in your nutrition program, things like that. So we just wanted you to see these so that these are kind of top of mind as you're working through your budget development process right now between your board and with your leadership team. Next slide. The big thing here, and I think this is what's really important to know, is that because of the growth in the state general fund, there have been a lot more contributions to the state Prop 98 reserve amount. That reserve now equals more than 3% of the K-12 portion of Prop 98. Now that causes a trigger, and the trigger is the school district reserve cap. This is absolutely critical for you to know. So the reserve cap is required that you would have no more than 10% sitting in your assigned and unassigned funds. Those are your real general reserves that staff manages those. Let's say you closed out your past fiscal year and you had $100,000 because you hired one nurse, not two. Oftentimes staff will just put that then in the reserve for economic uncertainties. and it's there and helps with cash flow and stuff. What we just need folks to know is that, yes, the trigger happens. It does apply to assigned and unassigned funds only. You're completely exempted if you're a small district, 2,500 and below, and you're completely exempted if you're a basic A district as well. So the other 350 or 375 of you have to really be thinking about, all right, what is our balance in our assigned and unassigned? Because there is a way then to get out from under this reserve cap. If you have your school board adopt your list of reserves, so then they then become committed. And if that adoption includes other post-employment benefits, other trust fund accounts, things like that, then it also then gets taken off of the table as well. So just really be thinking about that. Staff needs to be working with the board to make sure, because the worst thing that you could do is to be caught off guard and be forced to spend 2 or 3% on one-time things and clear out those reserves when you may be needing them in the out years. What we know about Proposition 98 coming out is enormous growth in the current year. You'll see the inclines like this, and then everything tapers off to more normal growth in the out years. Growth that is so soft that we're not even convinced that there would be enough to pay for cost of living increase in the following fiscal year or two. That's when you would really need to maybe pull back some of those committed funds, to help you through to weather that storm. So right now, you really need to be working through this to make sure that you're not inadvertently spending or being forced to spend reserves. So again, does not apply to OPEB, does not apply to committed funds or other trust accounts. Lastly, go ahead and last slide here. We just want you to see that there are other things that we're still, as good as that news was, there are things that we're still looking in the budget, things that you have to be planning for as too. We've been lobbying hard on maybe 2933 to fully fund homeschool transportation. That was not included in the budget. So that becomes a budget issue with the legislature. Pensions, the assistance that you've been getting the last couple of years on pensions runs out June 30. That means July 1, you're faced potentially with an increase to PERS and STIRS rates of a little over 2 percentage points. And so that's a hit that you need to plan for, which is why, the conversation about the reserves and what's available for OPEB becomes really critical here, because without assistance from the state, then you're going to have to be paying that. And some of the legislators are thinking, oh, we're giving you more money to LCFF, just pay your pensions with that. And we're absolutely saying that is unacceptable. So we still have some lobbying to do there. TK facilities was not included in the governor's May revision. Again, we're saying, hey, we need to roll out transitional kindergarten. We have a lot of facilities costs. Legislature and the governor so far had been, deaf to that. And then these other issues about just protecting these proposals to increase the base and protect ADA relief, those are part of the battle. So they've been included, but we need to make sure that those are protected. The reason why I just kind of ran through here is that so that the current year budget and how it reflects into 22, 23 is very, very positive. And we think this is a one-time period to where you may be thinking then about, the next half of this presentation, which is where can you make some investments to kind of lower your out year debt on like post-employment benefits, retirement funds, things like that. So I'm going to turn this now over to Ryan so that he can kind of put the cap on how then the GASB 75 program works with the OPEB Solutions program. So take it away. If you have questions, just throw these into the Q&A and I will answer those about May revision. And then Ryan, off to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dennis. I appreciate the valuable information you shared with us regarding the budget and the May revision. I think as Dennis mentioned, with regard to the one-time discretionary money and the reserve cap, this may be an opportune time for school districts to look at addressing those liabilities and setting aside monies into the OPEB Solutions program. I'll get into some information on that later with regard to some of the trends and what some school districts are doing or how they're approaching that and addressing those liabilities. But first, maybe I can give you an overall overview of GASB 75 with regard to, this is the pronouncement set forth by Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, with regard to, how you are reporting these liabilities on your financials or your balance sheet. This is a required national standard for retiree health care with regard to other post-employment benefits, or OPEB. This is an update of what used to be GASB 45, so that went into effect in June of 2017. And really, this is just an update of that pronouncement with regard to how districts are reporting these liabilities, and sort of in an effort by GASB to be a little bit more transparent with what these liabilities are and how they're being reported, how they're being calculated, et cetera. So if you look at the next slide, that gets into sort of the notable changes from GASB. So the biggest change is now that this is no longer a footnote that used to be applicable with GASB 45, but rather now it moves front and center to your balance sheet, and it's reflected as your net OPEB liability. So, previously you could just sort of make note of that, but now with regard to a net OPEB liability, that also takes into account not only the liability itself, but what assets are used or are in place to pay those liabilities. So that's where that net OPEB liability comes into effect. Other changes, the determination of the discount rate. I think there's more guidance on, what would be applicable based on how assets would be invested for those liabilities. So that's a big part of that, and how that determines the liabilities as well as some frequency of when the actuarial valuation is completed for school districts. That is now a standard 2 years. Previously, it was sort of based on the size of the district with regard to the number of students, whether it's completed on a 2-year basis or 3-year basis. So now, with regard to this update to GASB 75, again, this is an effort by GASB to be transparent with how these liabilities are calculated, the methods that they're being used to calculate that, how it's disclosed, et cetera, so that there's a little bit more uniformity across the board with the districts in reporting this liability. With that, we can go to sort of, the trends and practices of, how are districts addressing these liabilities. I think the next slide kind of outlines kind of the basic 3 methods that districts are dealing with these unfunded obligations. I would say the majority of districts are using the first 2, whether it's a pay-as-you-go or setting aside funds in a general reserve. The third option, the trust pre-funding, or setting up a separate trust to hold those assets. There are a lot of advantages to that with regard to comparing it to the pay-as-you-go or setting aside funds in the general reserve. The next slide is sort of a illustration of those first 2 options with regard to pay-as-you-go or setting aside funds in your general reserve. So we tried to illustrate this with, sort of the school district and utilizing the district's general fund to pay these liabilities when they come up. So whether it's for OPEB or for pension, it's paid directly out of that of the district's general fund directly for, in the case of OPEB, or your retiring medical costs or your pension cost. So, that's sort of, you can almost sort of think of that as almost like a checking account, just using the money to pay out without any, sort of a pay as you go as those costs come up each year for your retiree medical benefits. We have other districts that might set aside funds in the general reserve where they could potentially earmark those general funds. I think some districts call it like a Fund 20 or something else, where it's essentially earmarked for that liability. But again, it's coming out of the general fund, earmarked for that purpose. And then with the next slide, we try to illustrate, well, there's also the option of pre-funding or setting up a trust, in this case, it would be a 115 trust, where now the district can set aside assets directly into these trusts, or as illustrated in this, as a separate bucket outside of the general fund. And with that, from that fund, that can be used to reimburse or pay directly those liabilities related to OPEB or pension. So again, this is outside of the general fund, separate, where a 115 trust is set up for that specific liability. And with that are sort of additional advantages over the general fund, where, you know, by setting up this trust, you have specific assets for those liabilities, essentially freeing up the general fund from those liabilities. And in this case, you know, we sort of reflect that as a rainy day bucket. So with that, maybe I could skip to the next slide. With regard to, you know, that method of setting up the 115 trust, where PARS has partnership with CSBA on this OPEB solutions program. It's meant to address the GASB 75 reporting issues with addressing these liabilities, where a compliant trust is set up for pre-funding of these liabilities for your post-employment benefits, where the benefit of that is that these assets now count against those liabilities, unlike what would be done with the general fund, because of the IRS approved 115 trust, because now these assets are for that specific liability and can only be used for those specific liabilities. So in that sense, it's an irrevocable trust that can only be used for those specific liabilities. And that's where the fund protects, you know, these assets from diversion to other uses. So again, those assets that have been created to put into the trust for the liabilities cannot be used for any other purpose except for the expenses related to your OPEB. And with that, because it is in a 115 IRS approved trust, there is also the potential for a greater rate of return on those assets. So that is a significant advantage over your general fund, where you know, oftentimes you're lucky to get 0.5% or 1% on those on that general fund, where now you have the ability to put it into a portfolio with equity exposure and try to earn a higher rate of return. So that's where GFOA considers it, that's the Finance Officers Association, they consider it best practice, because now the district is being proactive, setting up a trust. You are able to protect those assets for specific liabilities and try to earn a higher rate of return. And, you know, part of that is these assets are always accessible at any time for those specific liabilities. So again, that's where looking at setting up a trust, it's considered best practice by GFOA. And part of that, you know, because the district is being proactive in addressing these liabilities, that can have the additional effect of also strengthening credit rating for the district, because rating agencies will look at, well, what are the district's liabilities? You know, how is it growing? What is the district doing to address those liabilities? And seeing the district being proactive with the setting up of a 115 trust for that specific liability can improve the credit rating of the district. Go to the next slide. And, you know, part of setting up the trust, sometimes there can be misconceptions or misunderstandings with regard to what the intent of the trust is and what does that do, or what if I do something else. I think the first misconception that's often associated with the pre-funding is, well, I can lower my liability if I just put money in the general fund. I mentioned that as sort of the second option that sometimes districts are doing, rather than paying out of the general fund, or in addition to paying from their general fund, where they will earmark those funds. But because, again, it is only in the general fund and not in a dedicated 115 trust, that is irrevocable only to be used for those specific liabilities, you're not able to recognize those assets within the general fund towards those liabilities. So yeah, in a sense, you might have it earmarked, but because it's not in a 115 trust, that will not lower your liability with regard to your OPEB benefits. And the second one, again, this is another misconception, I think often confused with the irrevocable trust naming or moniker of it, is that, you know, if you set up a pre-funding trust, you're obligated to make regular contributions, but that again is really at the discretion of the district, because the first part of addressing these liabilities is setting up the trust, but with regard to making contributions, that is at the discretion of the district. You know, how often do you want to put in money, at what dollar amount, or what frequency, or is there regular contributions? You know, part of that is, you know, looking at your actuarial valuation to try to pay that down with regard to the actuarially determined contribution. With regard to, you know, essentially the actuary is trying to set up a budget tool for paying that down. But again, that's at the discretion of the district of, you know, how often do you put in contributions and at what dollar amount. So that's really at the district's discretion to determine, you know, the funding schedule or making of regular contributions, and really at the discretion of the district. And then lastly, again, with that, as I mentioned, with the irrevocable trust, if I set up a pre-funding trust, the money will be stuck there even if I eliminate retiree benefits. So that, again, is another misconception, because those assets are there for the exclusive benefit of the retirees. In the event that retirement benefits are eliminated and all obligations are paid off, that money would be returned to the district, because again, it's put into a trust for the exclusive benefit of these participants that would receive retirement benefits. And in the event that the retirement benefits are eliminated and all obligations have been paid off, that money would be returned to the school district. So if we could skip to the next slide, please. I mentioned earlier with regard to the actuarial valuation, you can sort of think of that as sort of a snapshot of the district's liability at a specific time, where the actuary is going to look at the benefits that are accrued each year and over the, you know, the number of years for retirees for the actuarial liability, and then also looking at, well, what assets are in place to pay those liabilities. And we try to kind of illustrate the impact of pay-as-you-go versus pre-funding. So sort of in the middle column, you have the pay-as-you-go rate. You know, oftentimes you are lucky to get, you know, 3% or 4% based on the actuary, because really, you know, those assets sitting in the general fund are not expected to earn a high rate of return, or very minimal at the least. So, you know, with that in mind, there's sort of no benefit with regard to, there's no investments that go to help offset that. I think what an actuary will tell you with regard to setting up a trust is now you have the ability to not only have your contributions work for you, but also the earnings. And sort of the rule of thumb with regard to setting up a trust is that for every 1% increase in your discount rate, that can impact the liabilities by 10 or 20%. So in this example here, we're showing, instead of the 3.5% discount rate, we're using a 6% discount rate. That would lower the liabilities by approximately 28%, you know, from 8.7 million down to 6.3. As well as recognizing assets that are put into the trust, in this case, you know, 1.5 million. So again, that goes back to the different methods of paying these liabilities, whether it's pay as you go or setting funds in your general discount, you are not able to recognize those two. But if you set up a trust assets, you can recognize that. And sort of the net effect of that is the lower unfunded actuarial liability or your lower net OPEB liability as a result of that. In turn, that would help impact your actuarially determined contribution. You can think of that as sort of the funding schedule to help pay down those assets. So overall, there's benefits to setting up the pre-funding where you can lower your liabilities as a result of setting up a trust, using a higher rate for your discount rate, and recognizing any assets that you have set up in that trust. Skip to the next slide, please. So sort of, I think what Dennis mentioned earlier as well, with regard to the budget, you also have other pressures coming with regard to STRS and PARS rate increases and not getting relief with the budget for that. I think this is another challenge that is faced by school districts. And this is something that we've been aware of for a number of years, knowing that the ongoing rate increases from STRS and PARS is going to put additional pressures on school districts and their budgets. This is just reflecting sort of the ongoing contribution rate increases in the next 5 years or so. And these have been steadily increasing for the last few years as well. So again, and unfortunately, it's not looking any better with regard to STRS and PARS. I know with PARS, they've been lowering their discount rate. Years ago that started at 7.5% down to 7%, and recent discussions lowering that down to 6.8%. The lowering of the discount rate is only going to further put increased pressure on these rates and further strain budgets of school districts. So, this is a slide just sort of reflecting those pension rate increases that school districts will be facing in the coming years. Next slide, please. And then again, sort of a combination of the STRS and PARS contributions together. Again, this is an opportunity for districts to establish a 115 trust to not only fund OPEB obligations, but also pension, especially in lieu of the one-time discretionary money and reserve cap reduction issues. So, this is a way for districts to mitigate against these contribution increases, what we would call sort of a pension rate stabilization, where, knowing that, from the previous slide that there are increased contribution rates coming from STRS and PARS leading to additional contribution increases from those two retirement systems, this might be an opportunity for districts to set aside assets into a 115 trust to specifically address those rising liabilities as a result of the pension rate increases. Next slide, please. And again, this is just as a recap of the benefits of pre-funding. By setting up that 115 trust, these assets can be accessed at any time, whether it's for OPEB or pension expenses, as long as it's related to those specific expenses, because the district is setting up the 115 trust for those specific liabilities. So, in a sense, it's creating this rainy day fund where you are relieving the pressures or stress to the general fund because you have a specific 115 trust set up for these liabilities. And by addressing these liabilities, you're creating an asset and you have the ability to earn a potential greater return. As I mentioned earlier, with regard to the valuation, and what actuaries will say is, in order to pay down those liabilities, you have to put in contributions. And by having a higher rate of return or earnings on those assets, that's less pressure or less contributions required. So again, by setting up the 115 trust, you are addressing these long-term costs, whether it's related to your retirement or OPEB benefits or your STRS and PERS cost. You're addressing these increasing liabilities through the use of these 115 trust, where you can recognize those assets. You're trying to stabilize those increases. And, I think part of, or an overseen aspect of setting up a 115 trust for your OPEB benefits is that you are trying to protect that benefit to your employees, because if left unchecked or left unfunded, those are increasing and rising. And by setting aside assets, you're trying to, retain or keep those medical benefits for your employees. And oftentimes that's an important benefit that employees are considering, especially in their later years as they approach retirement. That's often a big concern of how are they going to transition into retirement and now have to worry about retiree health care. And by protecting that benefit for the employment, the district is doing a great service for that employee. So again, a lot of benefits. I tried to cover some various methods of what districts are doing with regard to sort of paying as you go, which is sort of the standard, or setting aside setting aside within your general fund where you're earmarking it. However, you don't get the benefits of setting up that 115 trust, earning a higher rate of return, being able to recognize those assets, lowering your liabilities as a result, and having those assets for the district to use. We can skip to the next slide. And I think with that, that's sort of the OPEB Solutions program that we have in conjunction with CSBA, or partnership with CSBA. This was meant as sort of a comprehensive solutions to what was previously GASB 45 and now GASB 75, to offer an option for pre-funding for districts to address these specific retiree medical liabilities through a 115 trust, and in doing so, putting the district in a better financial situation and protecting those benefits for the employees. So with that, I think that concludes my portion.
Perfect. Thank you, Dennis and Ryan. We will now be taking questions submitted by the audience. As a reminder, you can submit questions through your Zoom dashboard on your screen. So we'll pause, and if there's any questions, we will answer those at this time.
There was the one reference in chat asking for a link to the PowerPoints. I'm not sure if that's going to be emailed, or can we put that in chat?
Yeah, we'll make sure to get that out. There'll also be a recording of this video as well. That'll be on our CSBA videos as well. So we'll make sure to get that out. Correct. Any questions? We'll wait a couple more minutes here if anybody's typing in the chat. All right.
See can you set up, I think the question is, can you set up separate accounts based on bargaining units or retirement program? Essentially, you would set up a trust for the school district as a whole, but I think with PARS, we do have the ability to do sort of separate sub-accounting for that, if that was something that the district wanted to do. Generally speaking, that isn't common, but I think it is something that we could certainly do.
Thanks, Ryan. Any other questions? All right. Just a few more seconds here. We'll see if anybody wants to type anything in, Dennis and Ryan. All right, it looks like we have no remaining questions from the audience. Thank you to those who submitted the questions. If you still have any questions that you could think of and we weren't able to address them today, or if you come up with something later, please email them directly to csba@csba.org, and our staff will assist. Thank you to our panelists, Dennis and Ryan. Thank you to our members for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you virtually during our Legislative Action Week that is upcoming. And also note, CSBA is dedicated to providing up-to-date resources to our school board members. To view our recent webinars, be sure to check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/CSBA video, where you also can get a copy of this video today. If you are interested in attending future CSBA webinars, please go to our website at www.csba.org/webinars to register for upcoming webinars as well. Many thanks to our presenters. And with that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.